December 1944, a Third Army headquarters near Luxembourg City. The winter wind rattles the frosted windows of a stone villa, driving the temperature far below freezing while American clerks peck at typewriters inside. Mud dries on the tires of a lone American Jeep idling in the courtyard. The driver cuts the engine. A man in a crisp American Class A uniform steps out into the snow, clutching a black leather Bible against his wool overcoat. He introduces himself as Chaplain Captain Andrew Whitfield of the 28th Infantry Division, a Methodist minister separated from his men during the sudden German breakthrough in the Ardennes. He asks for a warm meal and a place to sleep before reporting to the rear. Within an hour, he is sitting at the general officer dining table, asking casual, precise questions about the lines of communication. He does not know that his presence has already set a clock ticking, or that a brief prayer will soon expose the fatal flaw in his perfect American identity. This is the story of a high-stakes intelligence game played in the freezing winter of the Ardennes, where a master infiltrator thought he could outsmart the American High Command, only to be brought down by a single slip of the tongue. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe. We tell the World War II stories that show how the right question kills the wrong cover. The man who called himself Captain Andrew Whitfield claimed to be 33, from a small farming community outside Nashville, Tennessee, serving with the battered 28th Infantry Division. He told a quiet, moving story of a circuit-riding Methodist upbringing, of a grandfather who had preached from horseback in the hills, and of his own calling to bring comfort to men dying in the mud. He spoke with a soft, slow Southern drawl that disarmed the tired staff officers who listened to him over their tin plates of hot rations. He talked about the heavy artillery barrage that had scattered his regiment, the confusion in the tree lines, and his long walk through the snow to find an American line. He looked the part of a shepherd who had lost his flock, his face lined with the simulated exhaustion of a man who had seen his friends blown apart by German steel. His real name was SS Hauptsturmführer Manfred Roeder, 31, born and raised in Munich, the son of a high-ranking Prussian administrator who believed absolutely in the thousand-year destiny of the Reich. Roeder had spent a full year studying theology at a seminary in Ohio during the late 1930s, an assignment designed to perfect his English vowels and teach him the deep cultural rhythms of American religious life. He was a prize operative in Otto Skorzeny's elite brigade for Operation Greif, a specialized unit trained to wear American uniforms, drive captured jeeps, and sow total chaos behind the Allied lines. He wore a tailored wool uniform taken from a dead American captain, carried forged identity papers that looked entirely authentic, and kept a genuine chaplain's Bible tucked into his deep coat pocket. He had already successfully infiltrated 2 American command posts during the opening days of the Bulge offensive, gathering vital coordinates before vanishing back into the trees. Roeder sat in the warm dining room of the Third Army headquarters, his boots clean and his manners impeccable, entirely confident that his flawless accent would protect him as he mentally noted the positions of the arriving American reinforcements. By December 1944, the European theater had dissolved into a frantic, frozen crisis. The German army had launched a massive, unexpected counter-offensive through the snow-choked forests of the Ardennes, catching the Allied command completely off guard and threatening to split their advance in two. In the confusion of the initial breakthrough, entire American divisions were shattered, communication lines were cut, and thousands of men were separated from their units in the blinding whiteout. This widespread chaos created the perfect cover for German infiltration tactics, allowing enemy saboteurs dressed in American uniforms to slip through the fluid front lines unnoticed. Skorzeny's disguised commandos were shifting road signs, cutting telephone wires, and gathering critical intelligence at the very heart of the Allied defensive network. Many American officers, overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the tactical emergency and desperate for accurate frontline reports, accepted returning stragglers and displaced personnel with little scrutiny. In dozens of rear-area command posts, senior staff let security protocols slide, trusting the familiar olive-drab uniforms and the shared American slang of the men walking out of the woods. It was a moment of deep operational vulnerability, where a single spy inside a regional headquarters could reveal the movement of entire corps and doom the upcoming counterstroke. But the relaxed atmosphere of the transient officer's dining room vanished the moment the man claiming to be Captain Whitfield was called away from his half-eaten dinner. The transient officer's dining hall grew quiet as Captain Daniel Stein, a 32-year-old Jewish-American chaplain from Brooklyn, pulled out a chair across from the visitor. Steen wore the same insignia on his collar, but his eyes were sharp, scanning the Nashville native with professional curiosity. "Welcome to 3rd Army Headquarters, Captain," Stein said, setting his coffee mug on the wooden table. "Thank you, Chaplain," Roeder replied, offering a warm, practiced smile. "It is a blessing to find a warm room after 3 days in the snow." Stein nodded, cradling his cup. "The 28th took a terrible beating at the river. Which regiment did you say you were with?" "The 112th," Roeder said without a moment of hesitation. "We were overrun near Oran. The shelling was immense. I stayed behind at the aid station until the medics were forced to withdraw. Then I had to make my way west through the German patrols." "A difficult journey for a man of God," Stein observed, his voice steady. "Did you happen to run into Chaplain Harris over there?" "He was heading toward that sector just before the push." "I did not," Roeder answered, shaking his head with an expression of deep regret. "The confusion was absolute, Chaplain. Men were scattered into the woods in every direction. I spent 12 hours hiding in a frozen drainage ditch just to avoid an armored column." Steen leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. "Of course, it is a miracle you survived. Tell me, Captain, how are you handling the spiritual burden of the men out there? A Methodist circuit rider must find this total mechanization of slaughter a heavy thing to witness." Roeder smiled softly, leaning into his Nashville persona. "The Lord provides the strength, brother. We preach the gospel in the foxholes, using the mud as our altar. The boys just want to know that the Almighty hasn't abandoned them in the dark." Steen watched him closely. "Quite true. I understand you studied at the Theological Seminary in Tennessee before the war?" "Yes, sir," Roeder said, his southern drawl smooth and flawless. "The Vanderbilt School of Religion. Class of 38. Steen stared at him for 3 seconds, his face entirely unreadable. "That is fascinating, Captain, because Vanderbilt did not establish its independent divinity school under that name until later." Roeder blinked, his smile stiffening slightly. "A minor slip of the tongue, Chaplain. The stress of the past few days has my mind clouded. I meant the standard theological department." Steen stood up from the table, his chair scraping loudly against the stone floor. "Of course. Excuse me for a moment, Captain. I must check on the evening service arrangements." Steen walked straight out of the dining room, down the long corridor, and knocked on the door of the command office. The report reached Patton within the hour. Patton's jeep pulled up to the gate, its tires throwing up dirty slush against the stone wall. 4 polished stars gleamed on his helmet, and the ivory handles of his revolvers caught the dim light of the hallway lanterns as he walked into the headquarters building unannounced. The staff officers snapped to attention, their conversation dying instantly as the general walked straight toward the private office where the visitor was being held. Patton did not raise his voice, but the cold intensity of his presence filled the small room completely. He stopped in front of the desk, looking down at the man in the clean uniform. "Did you have a good dinner, Captain?" Patton asked, his voice low and sharp. "Yes, General." "Thank you," Roeder said, standing up and offering a proper military salute. "The hospitality of your headquarters is deeply appreciated by a wandering preacher." Patton studied him for a long moment, his eyes fixing on the small silver cross pinned to the man's collar. "You say you are Methodist, from the Tennessee Conference." "That is correct, General," Roeder answered, his southern drawl perfectly steady. "Born and bred in the hills." "Tell me, Chaplain," Patton said, leaning his hands on the wooden desk, "how does a Nashville Methodist minister explain the doctrine of justification by faith to a frightened private in a foxhole?" Roeder smiled smoothly, his voice dropping into a comforting pastoral rhythm. "I tell them that grace is not earned by our military works, General. It is a free gift, accepted through a trusting heart, even when the artillery is roaring around us." Patton nodded once, his expression completely flat. "A solid answer, Captain. I have a great fondness for the old traditions myself. Before you retire for the evening, I would like you to offer a brief blessing for our upcoming counterattack. A short prayer in Latin, if you please. The old liturgy has a certain power in times of crisis. The Pater Noster, perhaps." Roeder froze for a fraction of a second, his mind racing through the liturgical traditions of his Lutheran upbringing in Munich. A Methodist minister would not typically use Latin, but he knew he could not refuse a direct request from a commanding general without raising immediate suspicion. He bowed his head, cleared his throat, and began to speak. "Pater noster, qui es in caelus," Roeder muttered, his voice dropping an octave as he concentrated on the ancient words. "Sanctificator nomen tuum, et venerat regnum tuum." Patton slammed his hand down on the desk, the sharp crack echoing like a pistol shot through the small room. "That is enough," Patton said, his voice dropping to a whisper that was colder than the winter wind outside. "The word is adveniat, not advenerat." A theological student from Ohio might make a mistake in his grammar, but a true Catholic or a trained scholar does not invent a past perfect tense for the Lord's Prayer. You are not an American officer. You are a German saboteur wearing the uniform of a dead man, and you have exactly 10 seconds to tell me your real name before I have you turned over to a firing squad as an illegal combatant. Roeder's southern drawl vanished instantly, his shoulders squaring as he looked Patton directly in the eye. "Hauptsturmführer Manfred Roeder, SS, Elite Brigade under Skorzeny. You chose your cover poorly, Roeder," Patton said, turning his back on the prisoner. "The right question always kills the wrong cover. Pease, take this man out of my sight." 2 military policemen stepped into the office, their boots clicking sharply on the stone floor as they grabbed Roeder by his arms. They stripped the silver Chaplain crosses from his collar, tearing the wool fabric, and confiscated the black leather Bible from his overcoat pocket. The German officer was marched out into the freezing courtyard, where a crowd of American staff officers and guards stood waiting in the darkness, watching the silent demotion of a master spy. The smell of exhaust fumes from idling trucks mixed with the crisp winter air as Roeder was forced into the back of a canvas-covered utility vehicle. He was driven immediately to a maximum security interrogation facility at the rear of the headquarters enclosure. Inside the damp, concrete bunker, American intelligence officers began a relentless questioning session that lasted for 6 hours straight. Faced with the immediate prospect of a military execution for wearing an enemy uniform behind the lines, Roeder began to talk. He provided specific details about the organizational structure of Operation Grafe, revealed the location of secret supply dumps in the forest, and gave up the specific radio frequencies used by his unit. The information was dispatched to frontline units immediately, allowing American security patrols to identify, corner, and capture 12 other disguised German operatives across the sector before the night was over. Captain Daniel Stein returned to New York after the demobilization of the Third Army, settling back into the quiet rhythms of civilian life in Brooklyn. He became the leading rabbi at a prominent synagogue in Crown Heights, where he served his congregation faithfully for 40 years before his death in 1986. He never sought public attention for his wartime service, but he frequently shared the story of the fake chaplain with his confirmation classes during their weekend lessons. He always told his students that when they found themselves confused by a difficult situation, they should ask a question in a language or context the other person does not expect, because the truth always reveals itself in a moment of unguarded response. Manfred Roeder survived his confinement in the military stockade and was officially processed into a standard prisoner of war camp after the operational crisis in the Ardennes subsided. He was released from Allied custody in 1948 and returned to a devastated Munich, where he rebuilt his life by pursuing a career in international journalism. In 1962, he published a deeply reflective memoir about his wartime experiences under Skorzeny, titled "I Failed at the Lord's Prayer," which eventually became a noted classic of post-war German literature. General George Patton never made a public statement regarding the incident, choosing to file the intelligence reports away in his personal records before his fatal automobile accident in December 1945. He did, however, scribe a single line of reflection in his personal diary that same evening, noting that a good cover is always built on what the cover lacks, not what it has. Some historians have argued that Patton's reliance on a linguistic and theological trap was a dangerous gamble, noting that an authentic American chaplain under extreme battlefield stress might easily stumble over a Latin grammatical rule or fail to recognize a specific divinity school timeline. They suggest that executing or detaining personnel based on such narrow criteria could have resulted in tragic friendly fire incidents during the chaos of the Ardennes counteroffensive. Others have argued the opposite, maintaining that the extreme threat posed by Operation Grafe required immediate, decisive action, and that Patton's sharp interrogation style was the only way to penetrate a flawless cover story. What is certain is that the rapid exposure of the infiltrator secured Third Army headquarters and led directly to the collapse of the sabotage network. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have done the same? Or would you have turned the suspect over to standard intelligence officers for a lengthy, formal interrogation? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories about how the right question kills the wrong cover, make sure to subscribe.